But houseboats started a long, long time ago, and that's what this story is about. The first houseboats in San Francisco Bay were actually known as arks. Now, the phrase ark is used nowadays to refer to any structure that's up on pilings, but that part of the story of the early arks really happened much later on, in the 1920s and the 1930s. But in the 1880s, there were a lot of hunters and fishermen who wanted to go up there. And the only way to get there was to bring your housing with you. And so what they did was they created a type of a structure which had a scow hull. A scow hull can sit on the flat, the low tide. It has a centerboard that you drop if you want to put up your sail. And the tide comes in, it rises again. And so for that reason, they created this type of structure here in the San Francisco Bay, and they called it an ark, just like Noah's Ark. And this is the Nautilus, the Bella Union, later known as the Lewis Ark, and you can visit it today over at the Hyde Street Pier. It's one of the few that survived in its original condition. And they came as humble as a two-person structure with a water keg on the back and probably no wider than 6 feet. But they were all built on this same basic style of a curved roof, a port that passed around the outside, an anchor only on one end. The interiors of the ark, they kind of capture the Victorian experience that you would have on land. That was the inside of the Nautilus. Here's a bathroom on a rather sumptuous ark. They didn't all have quite these amenities. These photographs are from an 1899 article in an English magazine. And this is an ark called the Crystal Palace, which floated over in Belvedere Cove. There were 4 horse-drawn trolley cars put together in a large barge. Here's one of the other rooms in this ark, called the Tongue and Groove. And here we see Belvedere Cove, and that's the James Donahue, the ferry boat sitting over there at anchor, getting ready to head over to San Francisco. In the foreground, we see a little snippet of the ark community. This was known as Ark Town. If we go in for a close-up, you'll see this little steam launch. That steam launch was the favorite, and the favorite was a taxi that would go from houseboat to houseboat anytime the Donahue was in, usually to take the gentleman of the house over to the ferry boat so he could go to work. This is written in 1899. The butcher, the baker, and others of that ilk who supply the needs of daily life have each his own little boat, which he sends around every morning at the usual hour for his customary order, and the meat for dinner and the ice cream for dessert are delivered as promptly to the ark dwellers as they are to those who are still in the city. The water was brought to the arks by a water carrier of Belvedere, a character known as Old Billy. Trash was picked up on Thursdays by waterborne scavengers. A steam launch, the favorite, picked up morning commuters at their arks and transported them to the ferries bound for San Francisco and returned them to their arks in the evening. This little structure in the foreground is rather interesting because it's an original scow. This is the kind of structure that they use as a model to then build the arks that became a grander image. And here's probably the largest of them all. This is an ark known as the Wellington. The religious fanatic who owned it believed that the world was about to come to an end. And 1906 proved him pretty close to that. But he ran telephone line underwater along with a water line from shore to this ark. All these arks were stored in the lagoon that you see in the background during the winter months because it was very shallow over there. And then when they had the opening day, they would lift the drawbridge that separated Corinthian Island from the mainland. And all of the arks would be paraded out from the lagoon into the cove, and they were all brought out by steam launch, one at a time. It was quite a festival from about the 1880s until the 1910 era. Belvedere, I would say, was the most organized of all the communities. In the foreground in the lower right, you can see the Crystal Palace, like the 4 horse cars put together in order to create the structure. One of the big events of the social season in Belvedere was an event known as a night in Venice. This was right up there at the epitome of the Victorian experience. Because what they would do is they would stage an evening when all of the arks, as many as 30 of them anchored out there, would be lit and would have open houses. And they would bring in a large barge, and on it would be a military band, and the band would play as they had a huge fireworks display, and then each of the ferry companies would send a ferry boat over that was completely lit with electric lights, and they would park the ferry boats, and everybody would watch the fireworks. This is the copy from the 1894 invitation. The Venetians of the West, realizing the attractions of their city of the sea and desirous that their friends should share in these attractions, have set apart the evening of June the 16th, 1894, when the moon, the queen of the night, is in the zenith of her splendor, to show what a night in Venice is. A perfect night will be enhanced by an open-air concert, interspersed with fireworks, a general illumination, an open house by the descendants of Noah on their arks. Here's the Mikado. This was a very famous and popular bohemian hangout in the lagoon. Now this next series of photographs, these are all taken about 1895. This is the ark Huhu, and it has a rather distinctive form of the four masts. There's their launch. Here they are on the porch with their Victrola. This is a great shot because it really captures this classic style of the ark, which usually had center doors and then matching windows on either side, the arched roof, and then the walk that went all the way around. Most of the arks, if not all of them, were built in harbors around the bay. A lot of them in Alameda, some of them in Sausalito, and a number of them in San Francisco in the Anderson Yard. Don Arquez actually built a few of the last arks, and the actual last ark to ever be built on the waterfront was in 1926 by Ralph Flower, and that's the Midway, which we'll see a picture of a little bit later. This is the way you got around, by rowboat. This was the ark community up at Larkspur. This lifestyle of the opening of the drawbridge and the moving out of the arks from the lagoon to the cove in Belvedere, and the same experiences in Larkspur, along the Sausalito shorefront, and in Alameda, began to fade after about 30 or 40 years. It was no longer in vogue, and so they put these structures up on pilings. So this is what most people know an ark as today. This is the same ark, the Huhu, but you can see that its masts have been cut off, and it's been stranded up on dry land. And what happened in Belvedere and Tiburon, all of these arks served as low-cost housing for Italian individuals, primarily migrant workers who took care of the gardens and the homes of the people on Belvedere. They had to have some place to live, and so the arks provided the perfect solution. This is the last ark to make the trip out through the bridge opening on opening day in Belvedere, and this is the Dobie ark. And the reason that it was the last one is because they were going to close the bridge. They were going to turn it into a cement bridge, and it would no longer go up and down. So any ark that went out of the lagoon that day would have to stay out. And the city had passed an ordinance to not allow anchoring of living structures in the cove unless they had sewer hookups, and they would not provide sewer hookups. I talked to a lady who was there that day. She said, in 1937 there was only one ark left. It belonged to Clarence Dobie. It was 50 years old at that point. He towed it round the bend. We never saw it again. All the church bells rang, and tears flowed down the cheeks of people. It was a very sad Sunday. The drawbridge was replaced by a concrete bridge that no longer allowed passage of the arks from lagoon to cove. Here are two arks down on Beach Road. They were evicted in 1968 to make room for the ark apartments. Here's the Hilton ark over in Tiburon, or on the edge of Belvedere, actually. It's on the lagoon. And what was happening there was they were going to develop the lagoon at that point. So all the arks who had lost their place on the cove and had ended up in the lagoon were now being evicted from the lagoon because of the value of the land. This is 1968.
I was there that day.
You were there that day?
That's Larkspur.
That's right.
They
Larkspur.
put chains around these houses. They were being lived in, and
Yeah.
they pulled them with bulldozers on a Sunday drinking beer.
That's right. Yeah, the county, the State Lands Commission ordered all of these arks to be evicted. A lot of them, or some of them, were structures that were not originally arks, but some of them were originally floating in the 1880s. Some of them ended up, as here, down on Ark Row in Sausalito. This is what it was like in 1890s, and the times, you know, they changed, there's no doubt about it. But for anybody who sees one of these old arks around these days, just remember where it's been.